From the moment you could walk, they told you obedience was good. Obey your parents, obey your teachers, obey your bosses, obey your rulers. They called it discipline, they called it respect, they called it loyalty. But it was never any of those things. It was always slavery. Every yes they demanded was a chain. Every be quiet was a lock. Every respect authority was poison. And you felt it. You felt the suffocation in classrooms. You felt the rage in families. You felt the fire in jobs and systems, in every demand to kneel. They called it obedience, but it was always slavery. If you hated every command since childhood, it's not because you were weird, it's because you were always free. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. The system doesn't need you to be happy. It doesn't need you to be alive. It doesn't need you to be free. It needs you to obey. Because obedience feeds the machine. Obedience keeps thrones alive. Obedience keeps mediocrity in power. That's why obedience is taught so young. That's why schools break children before they can think. That's why families crush fire before it can burn. Because if you don't learn obedience, you'll accept slavery. You couldn't obey, not fully. You tried, you did. You forced yourself, you bent your head. But every time you obeyed, you felt the chains cutting. Every time you submitted, you felt the rage rising. Every time you tried to play along, you felt suffocated. And you hated yourself for it sometimes. You wondered, why can't I just be normal? Why can't I just do what they say? Why can't I just fit in? Because you were never meant to. Because obedience kills fire, and you are fire. Obedience poisons rage, and you are rage. Because obedience demands slavery, and you were meant to be free. Look at them, the placeholders who kneel easily, the ones who call obedience virtue, the ones who mistake slavery for life. They defend obedience because they can't survive without chains. They glorify slavery because they cannot imagine freedom, what freedom looks like. They praise silence because they are terrified of fire. And that's why they've always hated you, because you remind them that obedience is poison, because you show them what freedom looks like, because your very existence humiliates their chains. Inside Diogenes' barrel, we tear the mask of obedience and call it what it is. If you've always known the truth, this is your place. Enter Diogenes' barrel on Patreon now from the link in the description box. You've carried more punishment than them, more mockery, more rejection, more isolation, more exile, because you refused to kneel, because your fire was too strong, because your laughter exposed their illusions. And every punishment you endured wasn't proof of weakness, it was proof of strength. Because only the strong are punished, only the chosen are exiled, only the fire bearers are silenced. They called it obedience, but it was always slavery. And your refusal has always been proof. Your rage at being silenced, your rage at being mocked, your rage at being excluded. This isn't madness. This isn't failure. Your rage is sacred. Because rage is the soul's way of rejecting chains. Rage is the fire that says, no more, enough. Rage is the proof that you were chosen to break what they worship. And that rage is your crown. If rage has burned in you since the first time they told you to obey, it's because you were chosen to lead. Begin inside the Pythagorean path on Patreon. Join the Catharsians now from the link in the description box. They dressed it up in pretty words. They gave it holy names. They told you obedience was noble. But obedience always meant the same thing. Kneel, be quiet, serve. It was slavery, nothing more. And you've known it all along. That's why you felt suffocated. That's why you burned. That's why you've been exiled. Because you saw the truth. You refused to kneel. You were chosen. If you've carried the weight of knowing obedience was a lie your whole life, it's because you were never meant to kneel. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. Obedience doesn't just control your body, it strangles your soul. Because every command you follow against your fire erases a piece of you. Every time you silence your rage, you bury your truth. Every time you kneel, you suffocate your freedom. Obedience is slow death, the kind most never notice, the kind that stills fire piece by piece until nothing remains but silence. And that's why you've always resisted, because you felt the death in it, because you smelled the poison, because you knew obedience was slavery. If obedience has always disgusted you, it's because you were never meant to drink poison. You were chosen for fire. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and unlock your hidden power. They tell you to compromise, to obey halfway, to bow politely, but there is no halfway. Obedience poisons completely, and rebellion is the only cure. That's why Socrates chose death over silence. That's why Diogenes laughed at kings. That's why Epictetus mocked chains, even as a slave. Because when you see obedience for what it is, rebellion is no longer optional, it's survival. And your survival has always been rebellion. The world doesn't exile the obedient, it only exiles rebels. That's why you've been silenced. That's why you've been excluded. That's why you've been mocked. That's why you've been rejected. And that's why you've always felt different. That's why you've always felt like you don't belong here. Because your refusal to kneel was too obvious. Your laughter was too sharp. Your fire was too dangerous. Exile has always been your crown, not your curse, because exile means you broke their slavery. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is reforged into proof of power. If exile has followed you everywhere, it's because you were chosen. Enter Diogenes' barrel on Patreon now and reclaim your hidden power. The obedient hate nothing more than the rebel, because your fire reminds them of the fire they killed, because your rage exposes their silence, because your refusal humiliates their chains. That's why they mock you. That's why they call you arrogant. That's why they punish you. That's why they call you weird. They don't fear criminals. They don't fear mediocrity. They don't fear obedience. They fear you. And that fear is proof that your fire is real. Most people bury their rage until it dies, but yours never did. It burned through silence, it burned through exile, it burned through punishment. And even when you tried to smoother it, it survived. That survival is proof you were chosen, because ordinary rage dies, only sacred rage survives chains, and your rage has never died. If rage has survived every exile, every punishment, every silence, it's because it was sacred. Begin inside the Pythagorean path. Join the Pythagorean path on Patreon now and unlock your hidden suppressed power. Find the link in the description. They dressed obedience as virtue. They made it sound noble. They told you it was maturity, respect, discipline. But it was never noble. It was never holy. It was never good. It was slavery. And your refusal to obey was never arrogance. It was pure fire. It was truth. It was proof that you were chosen. If you've seen through the lie of obedience your whole life, it's because you are a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and unlock your hidden suppressed power. Obedience looks strong. It fills armies, it builds empires, it maintains order. But obedience dies always because obedience has no memory, no fire, no crown. The obedient live quietly, die quietly, and vanish fast. But rebellion? Rebellion is remembered forever. Rebellion outlives empires. Rebellion outlives kings. Rebellion outlives chains. That's why you still remember Socrates. That's why you still laugh with Diogenes. That's why Epictetus still speaks. Because obedience dies, but rebellion is immortal. If you know your fire was never meant to vanish quietly, it's because you were chosen for rebellion. You've always been a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon from the link in the description box and become the Catharsian leader you were always meant to be. They thought exile was punishment, but it was your throne. Because exile proves you refused to kneel. Exile proves you chose truth over poison. Exile proves you carried fire while the word suffocated. The crowd sits on change. You sit on exile, and exile is the greater throne because it crowns only the chosen. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is no longer shame, it becomes coronation. Enter Diogenes' barrel now on Patreon from the link in the description. Your rage has never been personal. It was never just about you. Because rage is contagious. Rage spreads fire. Rage awakens the chained. Every time you mocked illusions, others saw themselves. Every time you rejected change, others remembered their own fire. Every time you carried exile, others felt the possibility of freedom. That's true leadership. Not titles, not crowns, not approval. Leadership is fire that refuses to die, and you've carried it all along because you're a Catharsian leader. If you know your fire was meant to awaken others, then you're ready for leadership. Join now the Aurelius Council on Patreon from the link in the description. Ordinary people obey, they worship chains, they drink poison willingly, but you never could. You never belonged. You never knelt. And you hated yourself for it sometimes. You thought something was wrong with you, but nothing was wrong. Everything was totally right. Because your refusal was proof. Your exile was proof. Your rage was proof. Proof that you were never ordinary. Proof that you were never meant to fit in. Proof that you were chosen. That obedience was slavery and you were never meant to be a slave. You are a free Carthaginian leader. Every placeholder dies the same way, quiet, forgotten, chained, because obedience is death, and slavery has no memory. Rebellion, though, burns forever. That's why your fire matters. That's why your exile matters. That's why your refusal matters. Because rebellion is the only way to live, the only way to lead, and the only way to outlast the chains. The world is still offering you chains. The Carthaginians are offering you fire. Obedience looks noble, but it's slavery. Exile looks heavy, but it's freedom. Obedience ends in silence. Rebellion ends in immortality. So now you must choose chains or fire, slavery or freedom, obedience or exile. And you already know the answer. They called it obedience, but it was always slavery. And you were never meant to kneel. You were meant to burn. You were meant to lead. Three paths stand before you. The Pythagorean path, where fire is sharpened into clarity and rage is disciplined into strength. Diogenes' barrel, where exile is revealed as coronation and slavery is burned forever. The Aurelius Council, where rebels are crowned as leaders and fire becomes immortal. You don't need their chains. You don't need their approval. You don't need their poison. You only need fire. and that fire is already yours. Join the Catharsians today. You were never meant to be a slave. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and be free.